Well, joining me now is Robert Kelly. He's a professor of political science at Pusan National University and a specialist on Korean affairs. And in London, we have law professor Constantino Grasso. He's a former rapporteur for an EU project to prevent fraud, corruption and bribery. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Robert Kelly, let me begin with you. So we have Park, sentenced to 24 years. Prosecutors now on 30. We have Lee, formerly jailed, facing trial. Two former presidents. What does this tell us about the current zeitgeist in South Korea when it comes to tackling corruption? Because it seems as if they're gunning for them.
Yeah, and every single South Korean president since democratization in the 80s has wound up investigated. Some of them wound up in jail. This has become sort of a regular problem, actually, in South Korean politics, right? There's concern that this might become so endemic that it drives talented people away from running for the presidency. I think the big story, the large story in the background, is that the South Korean state and South Korean big business, the largest conglomerates, are called the chaebol. The chaebol and the state are too close, and there's a lot of money flowing back and forth between the two of them, and it becomes a huge temptation for anyone who wants to run for office to take money from these large corporations, and that's why this keeps happening again and again.
So, Constantino, when you look at the chaebol, is that at the heart of it? The fact that in order to actually get things done politically, you need to be close to big business. In order to get business done, you need to be close to the politicians. And I guess the two fit hand in glove. Corruption is the natural child of all of that.
Yeah, thank you, Imran. I think this is true. We have an issue here. I was struck about the discrepancy between the sentence, the very harsh sentence of Lee, and the lenient sentence that was imposed to Samsung Air. We have to understand that there is always, corruption is a two sides phenomenon. So, of course, if there is a corrupt politician, there must be somebody that is so powerful and wealth that can corrupt. And who can do this today? Nowadays, multinational corporation can transform a politician in a puppet. So I think that the issue of corporate corruption is very, very important. We have to fight against corporate corruption. And I think that Professor Kelly will agree, the situation in South Korea is very illustrative because of the chaebols. These very hierarchical, extremely hierarchical structured conglomerates, business conglomerates, they foster, in reality, unserving loyalty and passive acceptance of misconducts, corporate misconducts. So the South Korean government has to do something to change this.
Any chance, Professor Kelly, that we have political revenge taking place here? Sure, everybody's corrupt, but the current administration is trying to knock out the previous administration.
Yeah, one hears that among conservatives in South Korea. I don't know. I'm a little wary about sort of going down that route because that quickly sort of becomes a real partisan sort of food fight here. But I mean, certainly conservatives feel like, yes, the last two conservative presidents are both going to show up in jail and within, a year of a liberal president taking office. Like I said, I'm a political scientist. I'm not an economist. I think just in terms of sort of political stability, it would be good for the country's constitution if the habit of prosecuting former presidents were to relax unless there was really, really egregious corruption. The longer term issue, like I said, is that you've got these companies that are very close to the officials that run, and eventually, if you're going to sort of if you're going to pull apart that relationship, then you've got to have serious antitrust action, right? You're going to break these companies up, or you're going to have stricter reporting requirements, and there's a lot of things in terms of regulation that could be done up to and including real antitrust action. But the South Korean government has always shied away from that. It's never really happened, and so we get stuck with this rolling series of scandals.
Right. Okay. So that's interesting. So, Constantino, the fact that you actually have these big figures going to jail for long periods of time doesn't quite tackle the root of the problem. Sure, you punish the person who was at the very top, but without changing legislation, without having antitrust laws and so forth, nothing really substantial will happen. Is that how you see it as well?
Let me say something. I've always advocated the impositions of punishments for corruption, but now 24 years is a very harsh punishment. So we have to be aware of some risks. The first risk is the risk of politicization of the fight against corruption that can be used to get rid of political opponents. We are experiencing it in China, and somebody says also in Brazil. At the same time, we have also to avoid exemplary punishment, because we cannot sacrifice the life of an individual, even if she or he is guilty, just for the sake of general deterrence. Now, having said that, I think that the mere imposition of a sentence like this to a very corrupt politician won't solve the problem. Corruption is a pervasive phenomenon. It affects all the aspects and levels of our societies, sport, academy, everything. So we need constant prosecution. What we need is also investigative power. So we need the possibility to use investigative techniques, safeguarding the privacy of individuals, but techniques like phone tappings, for example, audio surveillance,
right,
they have to be used. And prosecution is not enough. We have to change culture. We have to change, put in place disciplinary measures that are effective, administrative procedures that are fair. We have to select independent people that are really independent in any decision-making processes. But most importantly, we have to change something. The dominant class has to accept that they have to sacrifice something if they would like to fight against corruption. They cannot anymore use their economic and political clout to obtain unfair advantages for themselves, their sons, and their families. So they have to do something. They have to accept that there must be some sacrifices. Without them, we will never win the fight against corruption. That is a global phenomenon. It's not something that is affecting only South Korea or Asia. It's everywhere.
Right.
Suffices to mention, for example, the Mediterranean countries, Latin America, or political corruption in the United States.
Right, of course. Robert, Constantino believes that maybe 24 years is too much. It's too heavy-handed, right? But then again, I think when we look at the massive street protests when news of alleged corruption had broken, isn't this really what the people want? They want heavy punishments for heads of state that do dodgy things?
Yeah, I think you're right that there's a lot of demand in South Korea that should go away for a while. I think 24 years is excessive. I agree with my colleague that this is probably too much. It's also important, too, that this not become mob justice, right? Just because a million people in the streets demanded that she go to jail for a long time. That's I mean, it looks like a lot of people, and certainly on television it was sort of amazing, right? But remember, South Korea's got 54 million people, so a million people in the street is, 2% of the population. So it's important that this not become some kind of, judgment, and ultimately there has to be real demonstrable crimes, and that's one of the reasons why you have a kind of hardcore of Park supporters who still haven't accepted this. I mean, you still hear conservatives say that actually she didn't commit a crime, that this was just a movement of money. It's not really clear that she actually violated a law. I mean, you need to avoid the sort of sense that, every politician who sort of gets involved with campaign finance is also going to wind up in prison. And that's kind of where you are in South Korea, right? They need to be very specific on South Korea. They need much cleaner, stricter, clearer campaign finance laws, because that's where often this comes from.
Now, and Robert, something that stood out for me doing my reading, the news of that 60-page blacklist, which was made public for the first time, right?
Yeah.
So this committee said that you have thousands of artists on the list, 9,473, excluded from state funding because they voiced criticism of Park's handling of the ferry sinking, that disaster that killed hundreds of people, the horrible tragedy, right? Or for showing support for rival political parties. So then I think to myself, well, hold on, this is not corruption. This is just almost, I guess, authoritarianism. Right, so is there a bit of an overlap going on here as well?
Yeah, no, that's all very true. I mean, this is also one of the problems of the Park presidency. I mean, she was sort of seen as this kind of autocratic figure. She was sort of monarchic. She was sort of locking herself in the Blue House and not coming out very often. She wasn't particularly popular. She didn't do public events very often. She didn't take press conferences that were unscripted. All these kinds of things. There was a lot of criticism of that kind of stuff. But of course, none of that's illegal. Now, the specific issue of a blacklist, my sense is that's probably illegal in Korea. I don't know the specifics for that one. But I mean, that kind of stuff gets prosecuted. But that, of course, isn't why she was convicted, right? And again, it's just, I think, just in terms of making sure that talented people want to be in government, you want to make sure that it doesn't become this kind of like all-purpose prosecution for everything people didn't like about your presidency. And I'm very concerned that's where South Korea is going. Right, that people are going to be afraid to run for office because politicians get thrown in jail so frequently.
Right, and Constantino, looking at Lee Myung-bak, prosecutors having claims of all sorts of, power abuse, bribery, embezzlement, tax evasion, and so forth between 2008 and 2013. But then separately, Constantino, they're talking about Lee embezzling $35 billion over 12 years between 1994 and 2006. So my question is, what kind of state architecture of corruption is there, given that obviously a lot of people would have known about this over that long period of time? So is everybody involved in this nonsense? Constantino.
Oh, wow, this is a very difficult question to be answered. Imran, thank you for this. What I can say, corruption is a subtle phenomenon, and it generates a web of dirty connection between corporate leaders, political leaders, and so it is possible that there are many people involved in these schemes. So yes, I think it's as I said before, it's also an issue of culture. We need a cultural change to fight against corruption. We have to understand that it's a plague. And what I like is that increasingly corruption has been considered as a violation of human rights. Mm-hmm. And I think this will be the new approach we have to follow. And as scholars, we have to foster this.
Okay, Professor Robert Kelly, final word from you. In a way, have these leaders been victims of processes that they themselves might have enacted? Because each time news came out of corruption, they said we're going to be tough on corruption. There's a mea culpa and so forth. But at the end of the road, they end up in prison. So in a way, have they been victims of some of their own attempts to fix corruption?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, you really nailed a lot of the big issues with corruption in South Korea in just a 20-minute interview, actually.
I'm glad.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem, one of the reasons why these things keep happening is because these guys come into office, they all say, or in Park Guen-Hye's case, right, these women come into office and they say, we're going to clean this up, we're going to stop this. Everybody knows corruption is a big issue in South Korea. South Korea's Transparency International score has been low for a long time. I mean, everybody knows this is an issue. Books are written about it. It's on TV all the time. And then nothing happens, right? And, right now, President Moon, who came in saying he was going to do something about this, he's been distracted by Donald Trump and North Korea and stuff like that. And so this issue is being, once again, pushed to the back burner, right? And if he doesn't get on top of this soon, early in his presidency, then later he'll be a lame duck. It'll get dropped, and we'll be talking about this again in 5 years. I mean, at some point, the Korean state needs to divide itself, really put a Chinese wall between itself and business, and that is really the problem, right? I mean, it's just not happening. There's just not a big national willingness, I think, to really sort of get into a deep, long, difficult fight with the conglomerates and really erect that barrier. And that's going to take a lot of political will. And so far, every South Korean president has just ducked that fight. Okay,
gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to all of you, or both of you. Robert Kelly, the suspense has been killing me. I've been looking over your shoulder for the past 15 minutes, but nothing has happened. But I wish you all the best to you and your lovely family. And Constantino, thank you very much as well for joining us here on the Newsmakers. I'll talk to both of you soon.